Hi, everybody. This talk is meant to prepare you for your class on Thursday. The class on Thursday is not specifically about gender-related claims. It's really about difficult claims in the asylum context. In particular, we're going to talk a lot about the idea of what is a particular social group and how do you construct an asylum claim by making these arguments around particular social groups. Gender-based asylum claims are just a really interesting area of asylum law because they tend to be claims that are very emotional and seem very obvious, but can be very difficult to prove from a legal perspective given the strict definition of what constitutes political asylum in the United States. So for this lecture, I'm going to focus on gender-based asylum claims because I think it will help you develop an understanding of how to argue these kinds of things in class. So you already went over the definition of a refugee in last week's class, but I'm going to go over it again. It's any person outside of their country of nationality who, because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, member in a particular social group, or political opinion. And race, religion, nationality, and political opinion are a little bit easier to define. We have more trouble when it comes to membership in a particular social group. That person also must be unable or unwilling to return to the country, and they must be unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. What is persecution specifically? It has to be a threat to the life or freedom of or the infliction of severe suffering upon those who differ in a way regarded as offensive. So, for example, that would not normally include hurting somebody in order to rob them, for example. If you just want to hurt somebody or try to get something from them or break into their house, that you're not hurting them specifically because you find something about them problematic. The motivation for persecution must be to overcome a protected characteristic of the victim. So it can't just be something that they want, like I said, to rob somebody. It has to be something that they don't like about the individual that they're doing this to, some protected thing about them, and that is the reason. But for that particular characteristic, the persecution would not be happening. So what is a particular social group? First, it's people with a common immutable characteristic. And the group cannot change or should not be required to change because that characteristic is fundamental to their individual identities. One good example that will come up later is if somebody says that they're homosexual. They have a common immutable characteristic. They say, this is a characteristic I have. Other people have it too. I cannot change it. I shouldn't be required to change it. And I'm not the only one. This is a thing that a lot of us have in common. The group must have particular and well-defined boundaries. It cannot be too large or diffuse. Okay, so if I say I'm homosexual, this is a group. Everyone knows who we are. There are certain characteristics associated with it. It's not broad, it's not diffuse, it's not hard to define. Everyone knows what it is when we talk about it. That's what we need to show. I've put on the list here some examples of what we might call gender-based persecution. First, female genital mutilation. We will get into that shortly. Forced sterilization and abortion. That's one that's pretty straightforward at this point, recognized as persecution. Persecution for departure from traditional gender norms. Obviously, this gets more and more complicated, but traditionally, these claims have worked pretty well since the 1990s or so. Homosexuality used to actually be a ground of inadmissibility in the 80s, but starting with the Clinton administration, just like with everything else in society, there was a rapid change in culture and perception around different sexualities. So this started to become recognized. Not only was it not a ground of inadmissibility, but homosexuality, if you were persecuted for it, could become a grounds for asylum. Other things, marriage outside of your religion or custom, being persecuted because of something you've done outside of your culture, sometimes that can be construed as political opinion, and sometimes you can make an argument that you're part of a particular social group. We'll talk about domestic violence a lot. We'll also talk about issues around rape. I should say before we continue that there may be a lot of content on the slides that could trigger someone if you've had certain kinds of stressors in your past. So consider this your trigger warning before proceeding to the details on some of the upcoming slides. Well, female genital mutilation has a really interesting history in asylum law. First, we had in 1996, matter of Kasinga. This is a board decision that held that female genital mutilation is persecution. But in this case, what you have to think about is who is being persecuted? What is the protected ground? So what the board came up with is they said, okay, the particular social group here is female members of a particular tribe who have not been circumcised. So you'll see this in asylum law is attorneys and even judges trying to make really creative, sometimes long definitions of a particular social group. So the board was saying, okay, well, they're female, they're members of this tribe, and they have not been circumcised yet. If they meet all of those characteristics, then they are in danger of being circumcised. And so they're eligible for political asylum. You may think about this. We can talk about it in class, like whether that seems to fully work in this case for the description I gave you before. Like the group has to be discrete, it has to not be diffuse, and it has to be that the persecutor is trying to overcome a protected characteristic. In this situation, are the persecutors trying to overcome the characteristic of being a female member of this tribe who have not been circumcised? So that could be a matter of debate, but this is a long-standing case, and it was great, you know, whether the arguments work well or not. We love when we get arguments that will really help our clients. So going on with female circumcision, we had a case in 2005, Mohammed v. Gonzalez, and this was a helpful case because what was happening is if you had a client that had undergone circumcision in the past, you could show potentially under Kasinga that they had experienced past persecution. But it's not enough to show past persecution. You also have to show there's a well-founded fear of future persecution. Now, if you've established past persecution, you do get a presumption that you'll experience persecution in the future, but the government can rebut that presumption. And with FGM cases, the government always would, because the government would say, well, it sucks, it happened, but it can't happen again because it's already been done. So this case actually rejected that idea. They said that they can have a continuing fear of persecution because it's a continuing harm. It's not done once and nothing else happens. Now in that group, it became even broader because the social group they used in that case was all Somali females. And then in 2008, we had another case that said that female genital mutilation was so horrible. It's such an egregious, torturous thing to do to somebody that it could actually form the basis of humanitarian asylum on its own. I don't know if you remember from last class, the last lecture, but basically if you have had something happen to you in the past that was so severe that at that point, if it's severe enough, you don't even have to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution because it would just be unconscionable to make you go back to your country. We call that humanitarian asylum. So you can have well-founded fear of persecution without anything having happened to you in the past. You can also have past persecution that gives you presumption of future persecution, or you can have past persecution alone that is so bad that you don't even have to show a fear of future persecution. And FGM can qualify for this. Actually, FGM can qualify for all of them, depending on the different circumstances. I've taken the video off of this one because it was interfering with the slide. But here we have a case, matter of AT. In this case, the board held that there was no fear of future persecution because the circumcision had already happened, and the Attorney General stepped in, vacated the decision, and wrote her own decision. So you'll see that this happens sometimes with immigration. We have immigration judges, we have an immigration board of appeals. It looks like a real court system. However, anytime he or she wants, the attorney general can step in and independently say, no, I don't agree with this. I'm going to change the law. And you'll see this is not the only time this happens. So the attorney general stepped in, vacated, and said, no, no, no. FGM can happen more than once. You could have different kinds of harm when you come back. It may not be the exact same kind of harm, but you can still be hurt. And so they sent it back. And they said, you need to figure out the social group. And DHS can try to rebut her fear of future persecution, but they have to work for it. Because, you know, you can't just assume because she had FGM in the past that she cannot have any harm again. And in that case, the social group was Bambaran women and families that practice the Wahhabi religion. So again, this started to become a trend in how you define the particular social group. There's female, there's a tribe, here there's a religious aspect that is become standard for these kinds of cases. So I talked before a little bit about forced sterilization cases, forced abortion cases. The case law is pretty solid at this point on this. The courts recognize it as a political opinion claim, and just once is enough to show presumption of fear of future persecution. So we've definitely made headway when it comes to those kinds of claims. Here we have homosexuality, as I mentioned before. This one is pretty standard and well recognized. Sexual deviancy, as I mentioned before, was a ground of inadmissibility until 1990. And then the Toboso Alfonso case was a really big deal because it was at the same time and it recognized homosexuality as a particular social group for the first time. And then we had a grant in 1994 based on homosexuality. And it wasn't a precedent case yet, but the Attorney General made it a precedent case as of 1994. The same is basically true now of transsexuality. The government has recognized that being transgender is fundamental to someone's identity. So like religious or political beliefs, it can't be changed. It shouldn't have to be changed. And gender-based strictures that force someone to behave in a way that is abhorrent to their deepest held beliefs may constitute persecution. You saw that a little bit in the Fatin case that you read last week. So rape does come up a lot, and rape has definitely been recognized as something that rises to the level of persecution for sure, but it's not enough necessarily to have shown that your client was raped, because you also have to show the other factors. You have to show that they were raped on account of being a member of a particular social group, and that the persecution, the rape, occurred because of their membership in that particular social group. There is an understanding that rape is a mechanism to exert power over people and to punish and to harm. And there may be other motivations as well. There may be personal motivations, the same as robbing. Obviously, the person who is doing the raping in some cases is going to get personal gain out of that as well. But motives can be mixed. So it can be a criminal act that stems from the individual's desires, but it also is an act of control and power and a tool of punishment. So we're going to spend a little time talking about domestic violence. I know it's a little bit of a tough topic, but it's very challenging from an asylum law perspective. Why? Because you have a victim of domestic violence, sometimes horrific violence. But how do you make an asylum claim out of that? Usually domestic violence occurs in a household, and it's sort of difficult to argue that the violent partner is trying to overcome a particular characteristic. What is it that the male is trying to overcome in his wife? What is it about her that's making him persecute her? And is that actually persecution? Especially when other men like him are not persecuting his wife, but they're persecuting their own wives. So there's a challenge in showing that there's a group and in showing the nexus, because is he persecuting her because there's something about her that he doesn't like if there's abuse against the gay community. So this is a lot of hate towards a particular group. Is that what's happening here? It's very tough to fit it into an asylum framework. And every time you try to create a social group definition, It's tricky, unless you were to use gender. But if you try to use gender and say all women, then they're going to say, well, that's too broad. So we can't let everybody into that group. The group is just too big. Obviously, a man is persecuting his wife because she's a woman, but that's too big. So you have to figure out what it is that's special about her, that's the reason why he wants to hurt her. It's hard to talk about domestic violence without discussing the very famous case, Matter of R.A. Matter of R.A. is one of those cases that had pretty good facts, because the facts were so horrific in this case that it ended up becoming sort of the poster child case, and a good case for attorneys to push on up the appeal. Because, you know, if you've heard the expression, good facts make good law, bad facts make bad law. Because the facts were so strong in this case, it was able to get a lot of traction over the years and really push things forward politically towards recognition of domestic violence victims for asylum. Starting at the beginning, Matter of R.A. was a case in the immigration court. This was in the late 90s, and the facts were very sympathetic. The immigration judge liked it. The immigration judge said, sure, this works. We're going to call the social group Guatemalan women who have been involved intimately with Guatemalan male companions who believe that women are to live under male domination. And the persecutor is the men who seek to dominate and control them. And the judge further said that her resistance to his domination was a political opinion against the domination of women, and that she was persecuted on account of that political opinion. Before you go on to the next slide, just take a minute to think about whether that works for you. If you buy this, do you really believe in this definition or not? So I don't know what you came up with, if you liked the definition from the immigration judge or not, but the board did not like it. The board reversed the decision in 1999 and said, no, that definition doesn't work, because her husband was not persecuting her on account of her opinions or account of her membership in the group. He wasn't persecuting her because she was a woman, was intimately involved with the Guatemalan men or whatever. They just didn't buy it. So then what happened is the Attorney General stepped in, as I said we'd see again, and said, well, let me just hold this case for a minute, because I'm going to make a decision on this case. So Attorney General Janet Reno said, just hold. Don't deport her. I'm going to do something about this. She certified it to herself, 2001, and then she issued regulations that would protect victims of domestic violence. But we didn't actually get a decision from her by the end of her tenure. Moving on to 2003, we have another Attorney General step in. John Ashcroft said, well, okay, I'm going to certify this case to myself, and I want you both to brief it again, because I have to figure this out. And in this case, the DHS actually submitted their own brief supporting Asylum, saying, we also think she should get asylum, but we don't like the group you came up with. We're going to come up with a new group. It's married women in Guatemala who are unable to leave their relationship. That's what we think the group should be. Married women in Guatemala who are unable to leave their relationship. So again, I'll ask you to think about that. Does that work for you? Does that meet all the characteristics? Do we have a cognizable group? Married women in Guatemala who are unable to leave. Is that group socially distinct? Is the membership in that group the reason why the husband is persecuting her? So just kind of think that through and hold your... So moving on, we get up to 2008. We have another Attorney General, Mukasey, took jurisdiction, says, you know what, go ahead, they sent it back to the board and said, why don't you figure this out again? Look at it more carefully. It went actually back to the immigration judge for additional briefing on the case. He said, okay, well, let's look at this. Let's try to figure it out. But what happened is the judge said, well, wait a minute. Why am I going to figure this out? Both parties want there to be a grant of asylum. You want there to be asylum. You want there to be asylum. So why don't I just approve the case and let's just let it go? We don't have to find an answer to this. So that's what the judge did. Granted asylum in 2009. And we were all left with absolutely no legal precedent to work with. So even though this case had been pending for years, and we had cases pending for years, many of us who had clients who were victims of domestic violence were just waiting, because we would say, look, you can't deny this case. This is on hold, on hold, on hold. But then the case was approved with no legal findings. So finally, 5-6 years later, we got a decision. It was very exciting. Matter of ARCG, August 26, 2014. I was actually on the border working with families who were detained. We had active cases of many women who were victims of domestic violence. It was incredibly exciting because we went from having a lot of hopeless cases trapped in detention to a whole bunch of winners and obvious asylees because of this decision. The board finally recognized, yes, victims of domestic violence in certain situations are eligible for asylum, and the social group is married women in Guatemala who are unable to leave their relationship. They said that the gender is a component of it. It's not the only thing you need here, but it is part of it. And marital status is something people cannot change. So they said there are some immutable features of this social group, and we are going to go for it. Here's what the court said specifically. The group is composed of members who share the immutable characteristics of gender, marital status, and then there's a range of factors that could be relevant, like religious, cultural, or legal constraints. It's a little vague how they put this decision together, frankly, because it still wasn't that clear how this works out to be a cognizable social group. But again, it was very exciting. We were happy to get this decision because it was going to change the lives of thousands and thousands of people. And of course, once we had this decision about married women in Guatemala, it's not that hard to argue married women in El Salvador, or women in domestic partnerships in El Salvador, or women in domestic partnerships in Ecuador. Here's a little bit more from the ARCG decision. Married women unable to leave their relationship, they're commonly accepted definitions. They said that in Guatemalan society, people can recognize that. You can understand who this group is in Guatemalan society. It's a thing. A woman's inability to leave the relationship, that could be something that is understood in that country. And again, we could make similar arguments for similar countries. We could make this same argument and parallel ARCG with any case, with any country that match the description in the ARCG case. So now we have the bad news. We had a good run from 2014 to 2018. 2014 was under Obama, 2018 was under Trump, and as I mentioned, sometimes the Attorney General just steps into a case and writes their own decision. And that's what happened here in matter of AB. Essentially, Jeff Sessions, as the Attorney General, certified this case to himself, a case that basically relied on the ARCG decision, and overturned it. Said that this definition does not work. The standards are not applied correctly. Case is overruled. And although previous grants of asylum were not overturned, all of our pending cases for asylum based on domestic violence would now have a different outcome. So I had cases that won prior to this decision in 2018, and the same fact pattern would lose after 2018. One of the issues that Sessions raised and really focused on in AB was he said that this group is not really a social group, that they may have some characteristics that they cannot change, but that doesn't make them into a group, that there's really no evidence that they form this distinct group in Guatemalan society, and that persecutors want to target them because they're a member of a group. So for example, one husband will not target another man's wife because she's in the same group. Sessions also went on to say that ARCG created a problem because it now recognized this whole group of people eligible for asylum based on private violence that just occurs in someone's house. Following up from that, he's saying that, look, violence happens. Violence happens in the house. It happens not just in Guatemala and other places as well. And just because women or children are more likely to become victims of it, that doesn't mean that they're eligible for political asylum. So, and he follows up with the main point that he's making, which is that there's no particular evidence that this individual had a problem with all married women in Guatemala who are unable to leave their relationship. He didn't have a problem with that characteristic of the group. He really just wanted to abuse his own partner. So this is problematic, and this was the last slide that I'll show you today, and we could talk about it more in class. But this is what we're left with right now. As of 2021, we have matter of AB. It didn't directly make it impossible for anyone who's a victim of domestic violence to get approved, but it certainly made it much more difficult. And there's been some positive litigation around this. I have had some cases that where domestic violence victims still get approved. Some people have made creative arguments saying, well, it's not domestic violence. It's women in Guatemala who are treated as property, something like that. So they try to construct the social group in a way that it doesn't specifically hit on the ARCG social group that has been overruled. So this is a complicated issue. You know, you can't get it on domestic violence alone, and for gender claims, you have to try to come up with lots of different things, and sometimes try to see what sticks. But we can talk about this more in class. The issues that are raised here are helpful, not just for gender claims, but it helps you understand the process through which you have to think these things out. Sometimes it won't be a gender claim you're working on. Sometimes it'll be a gang-based violence claim that you're working on. Those are also very challenging because we have a lot of clients that have been victimized by gangs for various reasons. Sometimes because they refuse, the victims refuse to pay rent for the stores that they work at, for their businesses, and then the gangs will target them absolutely brutally for defying them in this way. How do you make an asylum claim out of that? What's the protected characteristic? What's the particular social group? What's the particular social group if you flee your country because you're worried that the gang is trying to recruit your son into the gang, and if your son won't join the gang, he'll be murdered? How do you get asylum out of that? So these mental exercises, and really it's like mental acrobatics that you have to go through to try and make these arguments. And we'll practice that a little bit in class with different kinds of claims.